The flashbulbs were blinding, but inside the marble courthouse, the only thing millionaire Jonathan Davenport could see was his wife's frail hand. To the world, he was the villain, the cheating husband standing by as his mistress, Victoria Roche, was on trial for the attempted murder of his pregnant wife, Catherine. The media had painted him as a cold, heartless monster, more concerned with his fortune than his family. They whispered that he'd let his lover poison the mother of his child. But what the world didn't know was that the real trial hadn't even begun. And Jonathan's reaction, when it came, would not just be a bombshell, it would be an explosion that would leave everyone in that courtroom and the world watching, speechless. The penthouse on Park Avenue was a monument to success, a palace in the clouds overlooking the ceaseless energy of New York City. Its floor-to-ceiling windows drank in the skyline. The polished marble floors reflected the light from $1,000 chandeliers, and the air itself seemed to hum with the quiet thrum of immense wealth. This was Catherine Brewer Davenport's home, but more often than not, it felt like her gilded cage. Catherine, at 28, still possessed the gentle, unassuming beauty that had first captured Jonathan's attention 5 years ago. She wasn't from his world of inherited fortunes and cutthroat boardrooms. She had been an art history graduate student, working part-time at a gallery he'd visited on a whim. He was captivated by her quiet intelligence and the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about money, not money. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance out of a storybook. He'd swept her off her feet away from her modest Brooklyn apartment and into a life of private jets, charity galas, and a last name that opened every door. For the first 2 years, it was idyllic, but slowly, imperceptibly, at first, the distance grew. Jonathan, the CEO of Davenport Industries, a global logistics empire, was always busy. A crucial merger in Shanghai, he'd say, kissing her forehead before a week-long trip. Putting out a fire with the London office would be the explanation for a string of 18-hour days. The lavish gifts kept coming, a Cartier bracelet, a rare first-edition book, a surprise weekend in Paris, but they began to feel less like tokens of affection and more like beautifully wrapped apologies for his absence. Loneliness became Kate's constant companion. She drifted through the cavernous penthouse, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her friends from her old life felt intimidated by her new one, and the society wives she met at galas felt like porcelain dolls, beautiful, brittle, and speaking a language of status and scandal she couldn't comprehend. Then came the news that changed everything. 2 blue lines on a plastic stick. She was pregnant. When she told Jonathan, she saw a flicker of the man she first fell in love with. He dropped his briefcase, a rare occurrence, and swept her into his arms, his face breaking into a genuine, unguarded smile. "A baby," he whispered into her hair. "An heir." The last word was a little colder than the first, but Kate chose to ignore it. This, she thought, was the anchor they needed. A baby would bring him back to her, back to them. It would transform their sterile palace into a warm, loving home. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. He came home earlier. He'd place a hand on her still flat stomach and talk about converting the East Wing study into a nursery. He seemed present, engaged, but the old patterns soon returned. The trips became frequent again, the nights longer. It was during this time that Victoria Roche entered their lives. She was introduced at a fundraiser for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was stunning in a sharp, intimidating way. Her raven black hair was cut in a severe, stylish bob. Her eyes were a piercing shade of blue, and she wore a blood-red gown that seemed to command the attention of everyone in the room. Jonathan introduced her as the new vice president of international strategy for his company. "Victoria is a miracle worker," Jonathan had said, his hand resting a little too comfortably on the small of Victoria's back. "She single-handedly saved our European distribution network." "Jonathan exaggerates," Victoria said, her voice a low, smooth purr. She extended a perfectly manicured hand to Kate. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct and unsettling. It's a pleasure to finally meet the woman who holds his heart. He speaks of you so often." The words were perfect, but her eyes told a different story. There was a flicker of something cold and calculating in them, a possessiveness that made the fine hairs on Kate's arms stand up. Over the next few months, Victoria became an inescapable presence. She'd be at the penthouse for late-night meetings with Jonathan. She'd pop by on a Saturday with urgent documents that required his immediate attention. She was always impeccably polite to Kate, almost sickeningly so. "Oh, you poor thing, you look exhausted," she'd say, her eyes scanning Kate's comfortable maternity wear with a hint of disdain. "Pregnancy can be such a drain. You must let me help. I have this wonderful recipe for a green smoothie packed with nutrients. It will do wonders for you and the baby." Kate, desperate for any semblance of friendship and wanting to believe the best, accepted. It seemed like a kind gesture. It was the beginning of the nightmare. The smoothies began as a daily ritual. Every morning, like clockwork, Victoria would arrive always impeccably dressed for a day at the office, carrying a high-end blender and a bag of fresh, organic ingredients. "No trouble at all," she'd insist, waving away the offers of help from Mrs. Gable the Davenport's long-serving housekeeper. "I'm on my way to the office anyway, and I can't have the mother of the company's heir feeling anything less than her best. Jonathan would have my head." The smoothies were delicious, a vibrant green concoction of kale, spinach, mango, and other exotic fruits. Victoria would pour one for Kate into a tall, frosted glass, and a smaller one for herself, which she'd sip while chatting about company gossip or her latest travels. It felt almost normal, like two friends sharing a healthy breakfast. But Kate couldn't shake the feeling of being studied. Victoria's sharp blue eyes missed nothing: the growing swell of Kate's belly, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she sometimes paused to catch her breath. At first, Kate did feel better. She had more energy, and the morning sickness that had plagued her first trimester seemed to subside. "See," Victoria would say, with a triumphant smile, "Dr. Roche knows best." But after a few weeks, a strange and insidious malaise began to set in. It started with a persistent metallic taste in her mouth. Then came the nausea, far more violent than any morning sickness she'd experienced. It would strike without warning, leaving her weak and trembling. Her obstetrician, Anne Sharma, was sympathetic but not overly concerned. "Unusual, but every pregnancy is different, Catherine," she advised. "Let's monitor it. Your blood work looks fine for now." Then her hair began to fall out. Not just the extra shedding that sometimes comes with hormonal changes, but alarming clumps. She'd find it on her pillow in the morning in the shower drain, on the collar of her coat. She started wearing it up, trying to hide the thinning patches, her scalp tender and sore. Jonathan was away on a 2-week business summit in Singapore. When she tried to explain her symptoms to him over the phone, his voice was distant and tinged with impatience. "Kate, the doctor said you're fine. Pregnancy is hard. My mother always said it was 9 months of misery for a lifetime of joy. Just try to rest." He sounded less like a concerned husband and more like a CEO managing an inconvenient problem. His detachment was a knife in her heart. The worst symptom was the neurological decline. A fine tremor started in her hands, making it difficult to hold a pen or a coffee cup. It progressed to her legs, making her unsteady on her feet. Then came the brain fog, a thick, disorienting haze that made it hard to follow conversations or remember simple things. She felt like she was losing her mind. Mrs. Gable watched the decline with growing alarm. A practical, no-nonsense woman who had been with the Davenport family since Jonathan was a boy, she had a healthy distrust of the new vet. She didn't like the way Victoria's smile never quite reached her eyes, or the way she'd taken over the kitchen every morning. "Ma'am," Mrs. Gable said one afternoon, finding Kate staring blankly out the window, a half-empty glass of the green smoothie on the table beside her. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn, But you haven't been right since Ms. Roche started bringing you these drinks. Victoria is just trying to help Mrs. Gable, Kate murmured, her voice weak. Perhaps, the housekeeper replied, her lips a thin line. But you were blooming before. Now, you're wilting. The turning point came one Tuesday morning. Victoria had arrived, blended the smoothie, and was just leaving for the office. Drink up, Kate. You look like you need it today, she called out cheerily. Kate took a sip, but the metallic taste was so strong it made her gag. She put the glass down, her stomach churning. A few minutes later, Mrs. Gable entered to clear the table. As she picked up Victoria's smaller, empty glass, she noticed something odd, a faint, whitish residue clinging to the bottom, something that wasn't in Kate's glass. On instinct, she didn't rinse it. She carefully wrapped it in a plastic bag and tucked it away in her apron. Later that day, Kate's sister, Sarah Brewer, came to visit. Sarah was a forensic chemist for the city, a woman who lived in a world of evidence and facts. She was horrified by her sister's appearance. Kate was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken, and the once lustrous chestnut hair was thin and patchy. Kate, this isn't normal, Sarah insisted, taking her sister's trembling hands. This is more than pregnancy. We need to go to the hospital, a different hospital. We need a full toxicology screen. Kate, too weak and confused to argue, agreed. As they were getting ready to leave, Mrs. Gable approached Sarah privately. Miss Sarah, she whispered, her face grim. I don't know if this is anything, but I saved Ms. Roche's glass from this morning. It looked different. Sarah took the wrapped glass, her professional curiosity piqued. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. You may have just done something very important. At the hospital, away from Dr. Sharma, Sarah explained the situation to an ER doctor, emphasizing the rapid neurological decline. They admitted Kate immediately. Sarah bypassed the hospital's standard lab and took the smoothie glass and a sample of Kate's blood and hair back to her own lab for an unofficial after-hours analysis. What she found made her blood run cold. The residue in Victoria's glass was harmless protein powder. But the sample from Kate's blood and a concentrated amount in her hair follicles revealed traces of thallium, a heavy metal, odorless, tasteless in small doses, and notoriously difficult to detect. A classic poison known for causing the exact symptoms Kate was experiencing: hair loss, nausea, and catastrophic nerve damage. It was a slow, agonizing poison that mimicked other illnesses, and it was devastating to a developing fetus. Sarah rushed back to the hospital room, her face ashen. She found Kate sleeping, a saline drip in her arm. She sat down the lab report, feeling like a death sentence in her hands. The serpent in their garden wasn't just venomous. She was methodical, patient, and diabolical. She hadn't just been making Kate sick. She had been meticulously, day by day, trying to murder her and her unborn child. The diagnosis hit the family like a physical blow. Thallium poisoning. The words hung in the sterile hospital air, clinical and horrific. The doctors immediately began chelation therapy, a grueling process to remove the heavy metal from Kate's system, but the prognosis was guarded. The damage to her nervous system could be permanent, and the risk to the baby was immense. Sarah, armed with her lab results, went straight to the police. She bypassed the local precinct and, through a colleague, secured a meeting with a seasoned detective in the NYPD's major case squad, a man named Robert Patterson. Patterson was a veteran detective with weary eyes that had seen the worst of humanity. He listened patiently as Sarah, a fellow law enforcement professional, laid out the facts clearly and concisely. The timeline of the illness, the introduction of the smoothies, the suspicious behavior of Victoria Roche, and the damning toxicology report. He saw the story not as a domestic squabble, but as a calculated, cold-blooded, attempted murder. The investigation began quietly, but with lethal efficiency. Patterson's first move was to get a warrant for the Davenport penthouse. He and his team arrived unannounced while Kate was still in the hospital. They found the high-end blender, and forensic analysis of its blades and container revealed significant thallium residue. They also found, tucked away in the back of a pantry cupboard used for specialty cooking items, a small unlabeled container of a crystalline white powder. It was thallium sulfate. The most crucial piece of evidence came from Mrs. Gable. During her interview, she told Patterson about her suspicions. Then she remembered something else. About a month ago, Ms. Roche asked me to dispose of some of her old personal items she'd left here during a late-night work session. She said it was just clutter. One of the items was an old laptop she said was broken. But Mrs. Gable, ever practical, hadn't thrown it away. She'd put it in a storage closet in the basement, thinking it could be repaired for a charity. The MOP's cybercrimes unit took possession of the broken laptop. It took them less than a day to recover the hard drive. The search history was a roadmap to a murder plot. There were queries for odorless, tasteless poison, how to buy thallium without suspicion, thallium poisoning symptoms, slow-acting poisons mimicking illness, and most chillingly, thallium effects on fetus. They also found deleted emails to a shady online chemical supplier in Eastern Europe and records of a cryptocurrency payment. While the police were building their case, Jonathan Davenport returned from Singapore. He was met at his private airfield, not by his wife, but by two grim-faced detectives. They informed him of his wife's condition and the nature of the investigation. The world expected an explosion of rage from a husband who discovered his pregnant wife had been poisoned. They expected him to rush to her bedside to publicly condemn the perpetrator, to use his immense power to call for justice. He did none of those things. His reaction was unnervingly calm. Publicly, he was a stone wall. He arrived at the hospital flanked by lawyers and spent a brief, formal 20 minutes in Kate's room. She was weak and disoriented from the treatment, and his presence felt cold and remote. He didn't hold her hand. He didn't whisper words of comfort. He stood at the foot of her bed like a visiting dignitary. He released a single terse statement to the press. "This is a deeply personal and difficult family matter. We are cooperating fully with the authorities and have complete faith in the justice system. We ask for privacy at this time." The media narrative, already skeptical of the billionaire and his much younger wife, erupted. The story was irresistible. The beautiful, manipulative mistress, the frail, pregnant wife, and the cold, powerful husband who seemed to be protecting his lover. Headlines screamed, "Millionaire husband sides with mistress. Davenport's icy demeanor fuels suspicions." Did he know? Inside the family, the reaction was pure fury. Sarah confronted him outside Kate's hospital room. "How can you be like this?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "Your wife, the mother of your child, is lying in that bed fighting for her life because of that woman, a woman you brought into her life, and you act like it's a hostile takeover bid. Where are you, Jonathan? Do you even care?" Jonathan's face was an unreadable mask. "This is not the time or the place, Sarah," he said, his voice low and controlled. He turned and walked away, leaving her fuming in the hallway. Even Victoria Roche seemed emboldened by his public coolness. When the police brought her in for questioning, she was the picture of confidence, with a high-powered defense attorney, Franklin Pierce, already by her side. She denied everything, of course. The laptop. It wasn't hers. She must have sold it or given it away years ago. The chemical purchase. Her identity must have been stolen. The thallium in the penthouse. The housekeeper must have a grudge. She suggested Kate was unstable, perhaps harming herself for attention. It was a masterful performance of an aggrieved innocent party. Her arrest, when it finally happened, was front-page news. Detectives Patterson and his team had an ironclad case, the forensic evidence from the blender, the thallium found in the pantry, the laptop and the financial trail. They arrested her at her lavish Soho apartment. Throughout it all, Jonathan remained silent. He didn't visit Kate again in the hospital. He didn't issue another statement. He went to his office every day, his jaw set, his eyes shielded by dark sunglasses. To the world, and even to his own family, his silence was a deafening roar of complicity. He was either a fool who had been completely duped by his mistress, or far worse, a monster who was somehow involved. The stage was set for a trial that would not only determine Victoria's fate, but would also crucify the reputation of Jonathan Davenport. The trial began on a sweltering July morning. The courtroom was a media circus. Every seat was filled with reporters, society columnists, and legal analysts, all eager to witness the downfall of the glamorous and venomous Victoria Roche. But she was only half the spectacle. The true focus of their ravenous attention was Jonathan Davenport. He sat in the front row of the gallery, not with the prosecution, but in a neutral space between them and the defense, directly behind his wife's family. Catherine was there against her doctor's advice. She was a ghost of her former self. The thallium had been purged from her system, but its ravages remained. Her hair, though growing back, was still thin and wispy. A persistent tremor shook her hands, and she walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on her sister's arm. But she was there. Her pregnancy had miraculously survived. She was now visibly pregnant, a silent, powerful testament to what was at stake. Her presence was an act of defiance, her gaze fixed on the woman who had tried to extinguish 2 lives. The Assistant District Attorney, Jennifer O'Malley, was a formidable prosecutor with a reputation for meticulous preparation and a closing argument that could bring a jury to tears. She rose to give her opening statement, her voice ringing with clarity and conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, gesturing towards Victoria, who sat impassive at the defense table. "This is a case about ambition, a case about greed, and a case about a jealousy so profound, so monstrous, that it culminated in a cold, calculated, and cowardly attempt to commit murder. Not just one murder, but 2. O'Malley walked the jury through the prosecution's narrative. She painted a picture of Victoria Roche as a brilliant but ruthless corporate climber who saw Catherine as the only obstacle between her and the ultimate prize, Jonathan Davenport, and his billion-dollar empire. "She didn't use a gun or a knife," O'Malley continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "She used kindness as her weapon, trust as her camouflage. She poisoned Catherine Davenport Brewer day by day, sip by sip, with a smile on her face, hiding the chemical agent of death in a gesture of health and friendship, a green smoothie." Over the next 2 weeks, O'Malley built her case brick by damning brick. Dr. Ann Sharma testified first, explaining Kate's initial pregnancy symptoms and her subsequent baffling decline. She detailed the horrific effects of thallium poisoning, explaining to the jury, in clear layman's terms, how the heavy metal attacks the nervous system, the gastrointestinal tract, and hair follicles. Next came Kate's sister, Sarah Brewer. As a forensic chemist, her testimony was devastating. She calmly and professionally detailed how she had tested the smoothie glass provided by Mrs. Gable and the subsequent blood and hair samples from Kate. She presented the lab reports, showing the jury the undeniable scientific proof of thallium in Kate's system. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was perhaps the most compelling witness. On the stand, her voice thick with emotion, she described Kate's vibrant health turning to frail misery. She recounted Victoria's insistence on making the smoothies herself, her condescending kindness, and the day she found the suspicious residue in Victoria's glass. "I knew something was wrong," she said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "I just knew it in my bones." She was like a fox circling a chicken coop. Detective Robert Patterson laid out the police investigation. He presented the evidence photos, the blender with the thallium residue, the container of poison from the pantry. The courtroom fell silent as the cybercrimes detective took the stand and walked the jury through the search history on Victoria's recovered laptop. He read each search query aloud: slow-acting poisons mimicking illness, thallium effects on fetus. A visible shudder went through the jury box. Finally, the prosecution presented the financial records. They showed that Victoria Roche, despite her six-figure salary, was deeply in debt from a lavish lifestyle and a series of failed personal investments. She was desperate. An email recovered from her deleted folder to a former lover read, "Once the little homemaker is out of the picture, it will all be mine. Jonathan will need comforting. I just have to be patient." Throughout all of this, Jonathan Davenport sat like a statue carved from ice. He listened to the horrific details of his wife's suffering without a flicker of expression. He watched her weep silently during Mrs. Gable's testimony and did not offer a hand or a comforting glance. He listened to the evidence of his mistress's betrayal, his face a blank mask. The reporters scribbled furiously. His coldness was the talk of every news broadcast. Why was he so detached? How could any man listen to this and show nothing? Victoria's defense attorney, Franklin Pierce, did his best to chip away at the mountain of evidence. He was slick and charismatic, and he tried to muddy the waters. He argued that the laptop could have been hacked. He suggested the housekeeper had a grudge. During his cross-examination of Kate, he was gentle but insidious, floating the idea that perhaps overwhelmed by a difficult pregnancy and a distant husband, she had been depressed, confused, maybe even harmed herself. The suggestion was so all that an audible gasp went through the courtroom. Kate, summoning a strength she didn't know she had, looked directly at the jury. "He is suggesting I would harm my own child," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I would die for my child. I almost did." The prosecution rested its case. It was airtight, a fortress of evidence. Victoria Roche looked pale, her confidence finally beginning to crack. Everyone believed the trial was all but over. All that was left was the sentencing. But then Franklin Pierce stood up. "The defense calls its first witness," he announced, his voice booming in the tense silence. "We call Mr. Jonathan Davenport to the stand." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. A hostile witness. Pierce was either desperate or brilliant. He was going to force the Iceman to testify, to expose his relationship with Victoria, to perhaps even implicate himself. Jennifer O'Malley shot to her feet. "Objection. Relevance. Your Honor," Pierce countered smoothly. "Mr. Davenport's relationship with both my client and the victim is central to this case. The jury has a right to know about the state of his marriage and the nature of his association with Ms. Roche, to understand her state of mind." "I'll allow it," the judge said, his gavel banging down. "Mr. Davenport, please approach the witness stand." Slowly, deliberately, Jonathan Davenport rose. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, gave a single unreadable look towards his wife, and walked to the stand. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment the world had been waiting for. The monster was about to speak. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. It felt as if every person in the room, the jury, the judge, the reporters, even his own family, was holding their breath. Jonathan Davenport settled into the witness chair, his movements economical and precise. He placed his hands on the wooden rail in front of him and stared directly at Franklin Pierce, his expression as neutral as a banker assessing a loan application. Pierce, smelling blood in the water, began his questioning with a confident swagger. His strategy was clear: to portray Jonathan as a neglectful, cheating husband, whose actions drove Victoria to desperation and Kate to despair. "Mr. Davenport," Pierce began, "could you please describe for the jury the state of your marriage to Catherine Brewer Davenport in the months leading up to her illness?" "It was under strain," Jonathan replied, his voice even and devoid of emotion. "My work required extensive travel and long hours." "Strain," Pierce echoed, seizing on the word. "Would you characterize it as a happy marriage?" "I would characterize it as a marriage facing challenges like many do." "And during this time of challenges, you grew close to my client, Ms. Victoria Roche, did you not? She was more than just your vice president." wasn't she? Jonathan's eyes didn't waver. Victoria was a highly effective and valuable executive at my company. Come now, Mr. Davenport, Pierce said, with a condescending smile. Let's not be coy. You and Miss Roche were having an affair, were you not? A collective gasp. This was the moment. The accusation hung in the air, ripe and scandalous. Jonathan paused, his gaze unblinking. No. He said the word cutting through the silence like a shard of glass. We were not. Pierce was taken aback. He had expected a denial, but not one delivered with such absolute cold certainty. He pressed on, trying to recover. So, the late-night meetings at your home, the international trips you took together, her constant presence. That was all strictly professional. Correct. So you had no romantic feelings for Ms. Roche whatsoever. Correct. Pierce scoffed, turning to the jury as if to say, Can you believe this guy? And I suppose you'll also tell this court that you were a devoted, attentive husband to your pregnant wife during this time. No, Jonathan said again, just as flatly. The answer surprised everyone. I would not say that. Aha, Pierce exclaimed, pointing a finger. So you admit you were distant, neglectful. My behavior was intentional, Jonathan stated. The courtroom buzzed. What did that mean? Pierce saw an opening, a confession of emotional cruelty. Intentional, you intended to neglect your pregnant wife while she was growing more and more ill. Yes, Jonathan said. Pierce smiled triumphant. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you hear that he admits it. He intentionally ignored his wife's suffering. He turned back to Jonathan. And why? Why would you do that, Mr. Davenport? Were you hoping she would go away, make room for Ms. Roche? Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Pierce. For the first time, a flicker of something other than ice appeared in his gaze. It was a cold, dangerous fire. I became distant. Jonathan began his voice, now carrying a new weight, a resonance that commanded total attention. The day after my wife told me she was pregnant. He paused, letting the statement sink in. That same week, he continued, Victoria Roche, in a moment of supposed confidence, told me a story. She told me about a friend of hers whose husband had left her for a younger woman who immediately became pregnant. She spoke about how easy it would be for such a woman to be seen as unstable, an attention seeker, especially if she were to suffer a difficult pregnancy. Pierce's smile faltered. Your Honor, this is hearsay. You asked him why? The judge interjected, leaning forward now, utterly engrossed. Let the witness answer the question. Jonathan continued, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. It was a strange comment. A seed. It made me suspicious. So I did what I do in my business when I suspect a threat. I didn't panic. I didn't confront. I gathered intelligence. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the prosecution table, his wife's family, and finally landing on Victoria Roche. Her face had gone chalk white. I hired a private investigation firm, one of the best in the country, run by ex-Mossad agents. I didn't tell my wife or her family or my own staff. I told no one. My business trips to Singapore and London, they were a cover. I was meeting with my team in a secure facility in Virginia. My long hours at the office were spent in a different office, one I had secretly leased, monitoring my own home. The courtroom was utterly, completely silent. Reporters had stopped writing. Every eye was on him. Kate was staring, her trembling hands held to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. We placed discreet audio surveillance in the kitchen and living areas of my own penthouse. We put a Jeep's tracker on Ms. Roche's car. We monitored her digital communications. My coldness to my wife was an act, a painful, necessary act, because I was told by my investigators that if the perpetrator suspected they were being watched, they would destroy the evidence, and we would never be able to prove what was happening. I had to let it continue just long enough to get undeniable proof. It was the most difficult thing I have ever done. He looked directly at his wife, his icy facade finally cracking, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing pain. I had to watch my wife suffer day by day, knowing that I was her only hope, and that to save her, I had to pretend not to care. Franklin Pierce was sputtering, his face flushed. This is an outrage, a fantasy. Is it? Jonathan asked calmly. He turned to A.D. O'Malley. The prosecution has a mountain of evidence, but I have more. I believe it's time to play the recording from the morning of April 28th. The day Ms. Roche had a phone call with a woman she believed was an old college friend, but who was in fact one of my undercover operatives. O'Malley, who had been listening with a stunned but growing look of comprehension, nodded to a technician. A speaker was activated. The sterile silence of the courtroom was broken by the sound of Victoria Roche's smooth, purring voice. The recording began. It was a phone call. The audio quality, crystal clear. Victoria's voice. You won't believe how easy it is. She just drinks it right down. Thinks I'm her best friend. Operative's voice as friend. Vicky. Are you sure about this? It's so risky. Victoria's voice. The risk is doing nothing. He's not going to leave his little pregnant saint unless she's out of the picture. And this way, it's perfect. The doctors are baffled. They think it's just a complicated pregnancy. By the time they figure it out, if they ever do, she'll either have lost the baby and had a complete mental breakdown, making her look unfit, or she'll be gone. Either way, Jonathan will need comforting, and I'll be right there to provide it. The Davenport fortune, darling. It's worth a little risk. Operative's voice. What about Jonathan? What if he suspects Victoria's voice, Jonathan? Please, he's so wrapped up in his work, he barely notices she exists. He's already annoyed with her constant complaining. He'll be relieved, trust me. He's a man. He thinks with his wallet and his ego. The company and the heir are all he cares about, and I can give him a much stronger legacy than that weak little mouse. The recording ended. A profound, tomb-like silence descended upon the courtroom. Every eye turned to Victoria Roche. The mask of composed arrogance had shattered. Her face was a grotesque canvas of pure shock. Her mouth agape, her skin the color of ash. The purring, confident voice from the recording was a phantom that now haunted her, exposing the raw, ugly ambition beneath her polished exterior. She looked at Jonathan, her eyes wild with betrayal and disbelief. He wasn't the fool she had played. He was the architect of her doom. Franklin Pierce stood frozen, his brilliant legal mind utterly short-circuited. His entire defense strategy, portraying Jonathan as a complicit, cheating husband, had not only been obliterated, it had been turned into a weapon against his own client. He had walked Jonathan Davenport right into the witness box and handed him the sword to publicly execute Victoria's last shred of credibility. He slowly sank into his chair, defeated. But the focus of the room was not on the crumbling villain or her vanquished lawyer. It was on the reaction of Jonathan Davenport. He had been portrayed for months as a monster, an uncaring sociopath. Now the truth was revealed. He was a protector, a strategist who had gone to unimaginable lengths to save his family. He had endured the scorn of the world, the hatred of his own family, and the private agony of watching his wife sicken, all while orchestrating a brilliant silent counter-operation. He turned from the witness stand, his gaze finally resting fully on Catherine. The icy mask was gone, replaced by a look of such profound love, pain, and regret that it was breathtaking. Tears welled in his eyes, real, unashamed tears that traced paths down his stoic face. He didn't wait for the judge to dismiss him. He stepped down from the witness box and walked not to the gallery, but directly to where Kate was sitting. He knelt before her in front of the judge, the jury, and the whirring cameras of the world's media. He took her trembling hands in his. "Kate," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion breaking for the first time. "Can you ever forgive me? for what I had to do, for what I had to let you endure. Catherine stared at him. The man she thought she had lost, the man she had begun to hate. And in that moment, all the coldness, all the distance of the past months recontextualized into a sacrifice of agonizing proportions. He had not abandoned her. He had been fighting for her in the shadows, bearing a terrible burden alone. Tears streamed down her own face as she let go of her sister's arm and wrapped her hands around his. "There's nothing to forgive," she sobbed, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her. "You saved us. You saved our baby." He leaned forward and gently, reverently kissed her pregnant belly. Then he rose and kissed her lips, a kiss that was not for the cameras or the crowd, but was a desperate private reunion in the most public of settings. The courtroom, which had been poised for scandal and condemnation, was witnessing something else entirely, a staggering display of devotion and a love story more powerful than any of them could have imagined. A.D. O'Malley slowly sat down, a small, stunned smile on her face. The jury looked on no longer as arbiters of justice, but as witnesses to a profound human drama. Even the judge seemed momentarily speechless before clearing his throat and banging his gavel, the sound barely registering over the emotional crescendo in the room. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Victoria Roche was found guilty on all counts, her face a vacant mask as she was led away in handcuffs. But the true verdict had already been delivered. Jonathan Davenport was not the villain. He was the hero. His reaction in court, the cold, calculated demolition of the prosecution's enemy, followed by a raw, heart-wrenching display of love and vulnerability, had not just shocked everyone. It had redefined the entire story, turning a sordid tale of betrayal into an epic of unwavering strategic love. Outside the courthouse, the flashbulbs were just as blinding as before. But now they felt different. Jonathan shielded his wife with his body, his arm wrapped securely around her, a protector returned to his post. He had faced down the serpent, endured the fire of public opinion, and walked through hell to bring his family back into the light. The gilded cage was broken, and in its place a real home was finally ready to be built. The courtroom drama had concluded, but its shockwaves rippled outward, reshaping the lives it had touched. For Jonathan and Catherine Davenport, the verdict was not an ending, but a painful, brutal, and necessary beginning. The journey from the courthouse back to the Park Avenue penthouse was a surreal blur of flashing cameras and shouted questions, a chaotic parade that Jonathan navigated with a newfound gentle ferocity. He shielded Catherine with his own body, his hand never leaving the small of her back, his eyes no longer cold and distant, but blazing with a protective fire. Once inside the silent marble sanctuary of their home, the adrenaline of the trial faded, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The air was thick with unspoken words, with months of fear, misunderstanding, and solitary pain. There were no immediate cinematic declarations of love. Instead, there was a profound and weary quiet. Catherine sank onto a plush sofa, her body trembling with exhaustion. Jonathan dismissed the household staff for the day, including a relieved and weeping Mrs. Gable. He then walked into the kitchen, a room he had seldom entered, and returned not with champagne, but with a simple glass of water, which he knelt to give her. "The investigators," Catherine finally whispered, her voice raspy. "The recordings. How long, Jonathan? How long did you know?" "I suspected something was wrong almost immediately after Victoria started her visits," he confessed, his voice heavy with the weight of his deception. "I hired the team a week later. I've known she was the cause. For almost 3 months. 3 months. The words hung between them. 3 months of him watching her waste away. 3 months of her believing she was alone, abandoned by the man she loved. She looked at his face, seeing the new lines of strain around his eyes, the flecks of grey at his temples that hadn't been there before. He had been in his own prison, forced to be the passive observer of her torture. "Every day, he said, his voice cracking. Every single day was a calculated hell. Watching you, knowing I couldn't comfort you, knowing you were starting to hate me. Kate, I almost broke 100 times. But my team was clear: if she suspected anything, she'd vanish. The evidence would vanish. And she might have tried something more direct, more banal. I couldn't risk it. I had to let her build her own cage. Catherine reached out, her once trembling hand, now steady, and laid it against his cheek. You were never distant, she realized aloud. You were standing guard. In the months that followed, the penthouse began its transformation from a gilded cage into a sanctuary of healing. Jonathan's metamorphosis was the most startling. The ruthless CEO, who lived on international flights and shareholder reports, seemed to vanish. He promoted his trusted colleague Michael Harrington to CEO of Davenport Industries, taking on the less demanding role of executive chairman. He sold the company's private jet. His days were no longer filled with board meetings, but with prenatal appointments, which he never missed. He was the one who drove Catherine to her physical therapy sessions to rebuild the strength in her legs. He was the one who sat with her for hours, talking through the psychological trauma, his patience seemingly infinite. He was learning for the first time to be not just a provider, but a partner. The climax of their healing journey came on a crisp autumn evening in late September. After a tense but ultimately uncomplicated labor, Catherine gave birth to a healthy 7-pound baby girl. She had her father's deep blue eyes and a full head of her mother's chestnut hair. As Jonathan held his daughter for the first time, swaddled in a soft pink blanket, the last remnants of the Iceman melted away forever. He looked at Catherine, his face streaked with tears of overwhelming relief and joy. They named her Grace Ann Davenport. Grace for the divine mercy they felt they had been shown, and Anne in honor of the sharp-eyed obstetrician who had first sounded the alarm. Life in the penthouse found a new rhythm dictated by feeding schedules and diaper changes. The echoing silence was replaced by the soft gurgles and occasional cries of a newborn. The minimalist art gallery perfection was softened by the cheerful clutter of a baby swing, a playmat, and baskets of toys. Mrs. Gable, now Grace's unofficial grandmother, doted on the child with a fierce love. Kate's sister Sarah was a constant welcome presence, her sharp analytical mind melting at the sight of her niece's smile. They were a family, forged in fire, their bonds unbreakable. One evening, about a year after the trial, Jonathan came home to find Catherine sitting by the vast window overlooking the city lights. She wasn't holding a smoothie, but a warm mug of tea. In her lap, baby Grace was sleeping peacefully. The penthouse was quiet, but it was a warm, contented quiet. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder, his hands protectively covering hers and their child. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About Victoria." Kate admitted, her voice free of fear, holding only a distant pity. Victoria Roche was serving a sentence of 25 years to life in a maximum security prison. Her name now just a fading headline, a cautionary tale, whispered in hushed tones. "I was thinking about how she wanted all of this." Kate gestured to the skyline, the wealth, the name. "She tried to destroy a life to get a lifestyle. She never understood that all the money in the world means nothing without this." She tilted her head back, meeting his gaze. "This is the fortune, Jonathan. Right here." He leaned down and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss, filled with the quiet confidence of a love that had been tested by fire and emerged pure, strong, and unbreakable. The view from the penthouse was the same, but for the Davenports, everything had changed. They had faced the monster in their home and the court of public opinion, and through a strategy of silent strength and agonizing patience, they had won. The story the world thought it knew was over, but their real life, the one that truly mattered, had just begun. And so the story of Catherine and Jonathan Davenport serves as a powerful reminder that things are almost never what they seem. The headlines paint a picture in black and white, but real life, real love, and real evil exists in the devastating shades of grey. Jonathan played a long, painful game, sacrificing his own reputation to lay the perfect trap, proving that the deepest love is sometimes shown not through grand gestures, but through silent, calculated protection. What did you think of Jonathan's strategy? Was it a stroke of genius, or was the risk to Catherine too great? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this unbelievable real-life drama shocked you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story with a twist they'll never see coming. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story from our channel.